Hello, I am Angelyn Spignesi, Arden, and I will be giving here a summary of my lyrical analysis of Chapter 3 of Jane Eyre. Now, I do so with the caveat that I do appreciate the insights of each chapter can't be completely summarized, at least not here and now, but they very much can be summarized. So here I go. I'm going to give the summary of Chapter 3 as well as the summary of Chapter 4. Chapter 3. There are ways to approach one who is coming out of an infiltration by destructive unconscious forces. And there are ways to approach that one that are beneficial. And Mr. Lloyd in Chapter 3 exemplifies such. Now, Mr. Lloyd is an ideal. It's an ideal to which we all can aspire. He is a physician of the lower servants, apothecary of lower regions. He's familiar with base elements, natural remedy, and he's not a reed. He indicates the necessity of having a human base in negotiating the mysteries and numinous forces of the unconscious in order to give them a voice, and to help the one besieged by them to find a language of who they are, what they want, and how they can be integrated to human life. To have a human base is to be someone integrated in spirit, mind, soul, and body, which allows a firm stance that is not to be overtaken oneself, yet also an empathic stance to the one overtaken in the face of horrific forces that have shattered another, while resuscitating that one to humanity, to human chamber. Now, Mr. Lloyd has this integration. He's firm. He begins by asking Jane to name him. Who is he? He locates himself humanly in front of her and asks her relation to him, saying they will do well together. He never loses his identity in their exchange or his position to her. He maintains a cohesive identity, exploring the possibilities available to Jane, and he draws out her viewpoint without losing his own or appropriating hers to his own. Bessie, who had been the one who locked Jane in the Red Room, is who sits with her, wiping her down in this return to life. Conscious and unconscious realms move into one another. They are not naturally split. Humans split them. Bessie later tells Mr. Lloyd that Jane had a fall, denying the reality of where Jane had been. Yet a Mr. Lloyd mediating presence helps one not yield to either denial or violence in the contact of such archetypal forces. That Mr. Lloyd is sent by Mrs. Reed shows that there is an inherent condition of the symbiosis with Mother to carry up and impart the contents of that unconscious that binds us to her, even though she herself continually defends from such contents through rejecting us. The child addresses Mrs. Reed for many years later. You knew not what you did. This statement resonates with the crucifixion, the cross. That is, though the nerves are shocked, Jane recognizes that it was her cross to carry what the stepmother could not recognize, yet implicitly demanded be found and imparted. When Bessie sings the ballad of the orphan child and God's protection, Jane cries, and here begins a human mourning for the loss of the father who could protect, yet instead descended, overwhelming her, and her vulnerable mourning accompanies the entry of Mr. Lloyd, human, paternal figure. Here is the necessity of a human, firm, and empathic relation to grow through the possessions, to know the promise of God as protective. Mr. Lloyd as apothecary is closer to natural remedy and hands-on healing, touching where one is inferior servant. To come back from the unconscious eruptions is to go through where one is inferior, the inferior woundedness. Coming back to the human world after possession by unconscious forces occurs with the emotions of dread and despair, a profound depression where nothing looks or tastes or feels the same, where there has been a complete alteration in orientation, of who one is. It comes with the sense of being marked, and one's skin is shuddering. Shuddering is the human response as one attempts to become human after a stay in non-being realms far from consciousness. That Jane does not fall under Bessie's excuses that deny the reality of where she had been shows a strength she gained in her encounter with the John and Mr. Reed forces. Through recovery from each possession, one relinquishes the grandiose fascination in becoming otherworldly, and this relinquishment is to gain strength humanly. Jane could not speak or dialogue with the unconscious forces when infiltrated by them, and the Red Room mirror reflected the non-being aspect of that. But Mr. Lloyd mirrors differently. He reflects human place and desire, and does so through a dialogue with Jane, inquiring into what makes her unhappy. She then can speak to him of having no family and being attacked. Such speaking of her fragmentation, her brokenness, is necessary in her recovering a humanity. So where there is deep depression, go within relation with one who is firm and attentively listening to what has infiltrated. If one comes up from the collapse in the Red Room, one can deny the infiltrating forces, which is succumb to them in literal or figurative death. For the death forces tempt, pull us, and hold one in their sheer awesome awfulness and grandiosity. And blood ordeals not imaged to word then incorporate, and one becomes the bodily seizures. Or one can, with the help in relationship, choose to speak the suffering of it, find the word of where one has been. The latter becomes Jane's choice when she meets Mr. Lloyd, who knows and does not deny conscious or unconscious realms. He sends Bessie down. Instead, he stands firmly in each, yet has an investment orienting Jane to the conscious lived human realm. Such speaking with Mr. Lloyd is a step in humanizing the window seat phantom edge and majestic Red Room tyranny. One begins a narrative of the figures of the unconscious. She says she's unhappy as adopted because of the raging stepbrother, the uncle's ghost descent. Extending out from mother's unconscious blood desire, unnatural child begins to speak from the depths of that when the father is dead. Yet the blood ordeals still have somewhat of a hold on to Jane, since she's not completely ready to leave the Gateshead value on material gain, worldly caste, and greed consumption, which is why demon and divine had arrived as seizures. And many of her challenges are in fact in her name, which she locates through Mr. Lloyd's questions. Her name, Eyre, E-Y-R-E, Eyre, to make a mistake, to wander from the truth, a manner of progressing to find justice, also to hear, to let another in. In the dialogue with Mr. Lloyd, Jane has a name, a caste, and preferences, and locates herself in temporal and spatial landscape, reaching beyond the immediate contiguous Gateshead way. Mr. Lloyd does not speak authoritatively, does not interpret or intellectualize or sentimentalize, and he's not seductive. Nor does he try quickly to remedy the situation himself, to fit her experience into his design, or try to moralize her suffering away. So here is not Father's law squelching her and Mother's secret desire, but Father's word bringing out her desire. Mr. Lloyd's ability to yield his viewpoint to hers with a level of empathy allows her developing empathy. And this entering the perspective of another is what begins to offset Mrs. Reed's strictures, John's inflation and rage, and Mr. Reed's suffocating constriction, that is, offset the Gateshead mode of impulse and unmediated consumption. Mr. Lloyd orients to one's humanity, and the interplay of his firmness with his empathy allows a relativizing, a humanizing of Gateshead blood forces in a way that allows their different figurations to begin to be narrated. Mr. Lloyd is how narration, begins to be favored over the immediacy of impulse. The chapter ends with the maids imagining, not gorging, their appetite. Mother's unconscious desire is to let the son and father forces of her most horrific depths pass through us as we take on their expansion and constriction, blood forces of her recess, and within human relationship carry them out differentially placed and understood. Mr. Lloyd, through his gifts of listening and dialogue, is the catalyst to go to the place of such teaching, a school for girls. This ends the summary of my lyrical analysis of Chapter 3. Now I will read my synopsis of Chapter 4 of Jane Eyre, which I entitle Black Pillar. Daily waiting, no word of school. More marked is the separation between her and the family. She sleeps alone, small closet, meals alone, all time in nursery. Aversion so rooted in Mrs. Reed's eye, the aunt will not endure for long this child, yet no allusion to the school. Cousins avoid her. Once John attempts a chastising, but Jane is leveling on his nose a blow. He runs to the mamma, now ordering her children never to associate with the smaller cousin. Jane says, "They are not fit to associate with me." It bursts from the banister. Though a stout woman, Mrs. Reed nimbly, she is rushing up those stairs, a whirlwind, flinging the child into the nursery, crushing her on the crib's edge, daring her to rise, to speak. A voice speaks through the child uncontrollably. What would Mr. Reed say? The aunts look a fearful wonder. Is it child or fiend who continues saying, "Uncle Reed and Papa and Mamma know. They see you shut me up in the nursery. You wish me dead." The response is a boxing of ears. For an hour, Bessie does the homily. I am the wicked and abandoned child. November and December and now half of January pass, Christmas and New Year's, where the usual festivity excluded. I witnessed Georgiana and Eliza in muslin and ringlet descending to the music below, the glasses clinking the good cheer. I would sit on the stairhead in the hum of conversation beneath, doors opening and closing. I did not want to be in that company, would have preferred Bessie and a kindness in the nursery, yet she is in the livelier kitchen and I remain alone. But there's my doll, sitting doll on knee, fire lowering, tugging at strings of the clothing, undressing to the bed with doll, nightgown folded, quote, cherishing a faded graven image, end quote. I fancy it with sensation as we lie in bed and listen to the company departing. Occasionally Bessie would come with a bit of dinner. Twice a kiss. 15th January. Eliza and Georgiana not yet summoned down. Eliza preparing to feed that poultry of which the eggs she sells to the housekeeper, then hoarding the money received also from the gardener for the flower roots. She ties up that money. She would sell her own hair for it, for its security. And she entrusts it to her mother's keeping with a high interest, recorded accurately. Georgiana on her high stool, artificial flowers and feathers adorning her curls. She commands me as I assist in the cleaning as Bessie's under-nursery maid, not to touch the furniture of those dolls. I was straightening them at the window. Now I sit breathing on the frost flowers dissolving to a carriage arriving. But it's more the hungry robin who catches my, quote, bacon attention, end quote. And I am tugging on the window sash to deliver the crumbs of my breakfast. Now Bessie is pulling me out of pinafore, scrubbing my face with the coarse towel, for it is I who am being summoned below. I am standing before the breakfast door, so unused to any territory outside the nursery, fearful. Who would want me? I tremble, quote, what a miserable little poltroon had fear engendered of unjust punishment made of me those days, end quote. 10 minutes of, quote, agitated hesitation, end quote, neither able to return to nursery or proceed to breakfast room until a bell from the latter clanging, now I must enter. Who is it beside Mrs. Reed here? I look up at a black pillar appearing to me, quote, the straight, narrow, sable-clad shape standing erect on the rug, end quote. Mrs. Reed signals approach. He is asking my age and name, and then whether it is I am a good child. Impossible now, the affirmative, I am silent. The aunt replies for me, the less said on that the better. We shall have some talk then. He sits on a chair, drawing me up to him, the face of the great nose and mouth, the teeth so prominent. He wants to make sure I know that the wicked go to hell and burn, that I know I must repent, ever being the discomfort to a benefactress. Benefactress? Now the Bible. He is wanting to know my fondness for this book. I reply, my pleasure is in Revelations, Book of Daniel, and Genesis, and Samuel, bit of Exodus, Kings and Chronicles, and Job and Jonah. He hopes I like the Psalms. No, sir. Shocking to him, I say. They are not interesting. Proof of a wicked heart. I must pray to God to transform that heart from stone to its flesh. I am wondering on such operation when Mrs. Reed orders me to sit and carries on the conversation herself. She tells this Mr. Brocklehurst she wants my admittance to his Lowood school. But those teachers upon me must keep a strictest eye because I have a tendency to deceit, and she wants me in this hearing. Cruel wound, for I had always strove to obey, please her strenuously, and now heart cut by the accusation in front of a stranger. She can only spoil this, quote, new phase of existence which she destined me to enter, sowing aversion and unkindness along my future path, end quote. Transform now only to the noxious child. All liars are in the lake burning with fire and brimstone. Yes, the teacher shall watch her. He is assuring, plainness prevails to the point of poverty. Habits are hardy. Quote, humility is a Christian grace, end quote, as is consistency above all, desired by Mrs. Reed. The proof of success of the mortification of worldly pride, his daughter's remark on the plainness of the Lowood girls, acting as though never before had those girls seen a dress of silk. He leaves, but not before handing Jane the child's guide, recounting the sudden awful death of a child addicted to falsehood and deceit. Mrs. Reed and Jane are left alone. The silence in which the woman sews becomes the surveillance of her by the child. Seeing this woman, possibly 36 or 37, square-shouldered, strong-limbed, stout, not obese. The underjaw is solid, low brow, and eye, quote, devoid of ruth, end quote. Skin opaque with flaxen hair. She runs the household thoroughly, dresses well, is never ill, cleverly manages with an authority only derided at times by her own children. Her attire is handsome. Sting of her words to that mind becoming, quote, passion of resentment, end quote. Her eye on mine, and she orders me out to the nursery, back. I walk to the door, then back across to a window, then right up to her. I must speak, a turn of being trotted. Speak, I am saying, if I were deceitful, I would say I loved you, but I dislike you more than anyone except your son, and this book you may give to your daughter, Georgiana, for it is she, Mrs. Reed, who is the liar. Her hands have ceased their sewing, eye of ice upon mine. What more is there I have to say, she asks, as though to an adult. Shaking throughout, quote, thrilled with ungovernable excitement, end quote. I am telling her she is of no relation. I will never again call her aunt or see her, and I will say to any asking it is with the most miserable cruelty she has treated me. How dare I affirm that, she asks. And, oh, aunt, how dare? You think I have no feelings, that I can do without love? You lacking any pity, you violently thrust me back into a locked room, though I have cried, have mercy, Aunt Reed. Punished because it was your wicked boy struck me for nothing. I will tell all. You are not the good woman, yet hard-hearted. You are deceitful. My soul expands in triumph. Quote, it seemed as if an invisible bond had burst and that I had struggled out into unhoped-for liberty, end quote. For that woman has a look frightened, hands raising, rocking herself, her face twists. She wants to know why it is I tremble so violently. Would I like some water? She wants to be my friend. She had to correct my faults. Quote, savage high voice, end quote, crying deceit. It's not my fault. She wants me to lie down, for I am passionate. Send me to school, I say. And her murmurs that she indeed will send me to school soon, and she leaves abruptly. First victory. On the rug where Mr. Brocklehurst had stood, victory of my hardest battle. Yet, that it was such an uncontrollable fury. Now the remorse begins. After a short time, a silence tells me, quote, the madness of my conduct and the dreariness of my hated and hating position, end quote. Aftertaste of vengeance, a sensation of poison. She reaches for the book of tales, Arabian, does not cease the swimming thoughts. She is walking out toward the ground sequestered, the trees silent, fir cones fallen, leaning against a gate into the empty field where there are no sheep feeding. Short grass nipped, gray day of an opaque sky. Wrenched, she asks, what shall I do? What shall I do? A voice calls, Miss Jane, where are you? Come to lunch. Once she would have seen as cross this Bessie coming down the path. Naughty thing, come when called. Yet now she responds more to what in comparison with her brooding seems a cheerfulness. This child is no longer, after the breakfast room scene, interested in the maid's transitory anger. Instead, heart lightness. Come, Bessie, don't scold. This action pleases the maid, saying, Jane, you should be bolder. You are, quote, little roving solitary thing, end quote. Bessie is to cook and prepare her for school. The others are away. No more scolding, asks Jane, and Bessie responds, then of a good girl, and do not be afraid, saying that if the child did not start at any sharp speaking, her fear provokes the reprimand. Used to Bessie, not to be afraid of her again, but at school new people to dread. Yet the maid states if you dread them, they'll dislike you. As you, Bessie? No, miss, of you I am fonder than the others. I tell her she does not show it. She calls me the sharp little thing and asks from where comes this new venturesomeness. The scene with Mrs. Reed is what passes through, and yet I remain silent on it. And Bessie is asking, am I glad to be leaving her? And believing my response too cool, asks for a kiss, mutual embrace, comfort of an afternoon, until enchanted story of evening, sweet song of hers a delight to me, gleam for the outcast. Okay, here ends the synopsis of chapter 4, and I will now give the summary of my lyrical analysis of chapter 4, and then in the next recording I will speak the lyrical analysis itself of chapter 4. So here is the summary of my lyrical analysis of chapter 4. After Mr. Lloyd's departure comes the preschool place where the stepmother remains averse to the daughter and shuts her up in the nursery. So before Jane can go to the girls' school, she has to break the nursery bind, which is both the mother and daughter's unconscious desire to stay fused schismatically. The nursery is where one is no longer within Mrs. Reed's unconscious body, yet still undifferentiated from the effects of her unconscious. One is crushed down by her on a crib. Once she attained a level of dialogue with Mr. Lloyd, the Reed forces now infiltrate Jane through language. The fact that Jane is surprised by her own words back to Mrs. Reed, statements that resonate with John and Mr. Reed's point of view, indicates that there is still a type of possession occurring, yet it is moved to the verbal level, no longer bodily seizure. The Reed forces talk back at Mrs. Reed through Jane. In the nursery place, the mother is somewhat less archetypally ominous, yet she is not humanly related to us. The doll is a transitional object to a loving other, and thereby could become idol, graven image. Yet it stands for the possibility of a more human relating. The nurseries where one is between archetypal mother, with whom we live in the unconscious, and human mother, with whom we long to be humanly in relation. As such, here's a problematic place in hunger and feeding. The external representations of the place, Eliza and Georgiana, hoard and extravagantly flaunt. Each is an excess of holding in and putting out. The hunger of the nursery is a feeding on oneself, which becomes an overextended giving out to the others. A cruelty can underlie giving out too much, and here is the cruelty, the destructive aspect within the antipathetic symbiosis with mother. Through the seizures of the male reed forces, one attempts to extricate from the unconscious of mother, yet that is never the result. Instead, they move one to various passages, the Eyre, E-Y-R-E, within the symbiosis pertaining to human anatomy. That is, one moves from the complacency with the death forces at the window seat, which is to have no body, to the imprisonment within her womb, red womb, which is to be inside her body, to being trapped in her hunger, the nursery, either giving out a bite or hoarding what resources there are. That is, the split sister place when one is in the nursery crushed by mother and not fed according to one's own hunger. The black pillar, the erection of the next male agent summoned by Mrs. Reed through her unconscious connection to us, is again a call to motion. For Brocklehurst sees everything through opposition. His binary view organizes all complexity into simple good and evil categories. This way of thinking does allow a rudimentary differentiation from the nursery regress. That is, his is a critical, one-sided perspective of opinionated thought, which is a beginning self-referential speaking. That is, I have this opinion means there is an I. A first distancing of daughter from mother. Jane can now look at Mrs. Reed, look her over. Yet, one must always bring the mothers along. The process of leaving the antipathetic symbiosis necessitates an inclusion of mother's unconscious, and this is signified by Mrs. Reed's curse upon Jane. One cannot split literally from her unconscious, for the unconscious is around, not within or beneath only. So it is, quote, as if, end quote, a bond was burst. There is a figurative bursting that is required. It is finding the figures and their meaning with and through the unconscious, imparting the unconscious, which is around both mother and daughter, which is the release from Mrs. Reed's hold. Anger fuels this release, and often screams are necessary to break the dangerous hold, that is, the resistance of both mother and daughter to remain in stasis. Often the only way the nursery bond can be, quote, as if, end quote, burst is through the anger of a critical condemnation. Anger fuels the release as finding the metaphor in it, the relationship, affects it. Jane says that Mrs. Reed's heart is stone, and her own is not. So there we have the separation out, finding with the anger, but finding the metaphor of the relationship. Stone heart, flesh heart. Jane uses Brocklehurst's critical, controlling, and polarizing speech back at Mrs. Reed, comparing and competing and promising to offer her view to the public for a public condemnation of the woman. And this severs her enough from the stepmother to finally become the permission to go to school. The gray field is the first place outside the symbiosis, yet still on the grounds. Unlike the shadows of the nursery, this gray contains an I, a self-referencing. Jane asks, "What shall I do?" So here is a self-reflective speaker. Bessie's call through this gray field speaks the decreased susceptibility to a moralistic scolding from without. Here begins a mediated, heartfelt relation with the one who previously criticized and distanced. They explore the meaning of the scolding of the past. And here we see resonance with Mr. Lloyd's teaching. Once Jane is outside Mrs. Reed's unconscious body, she can dialogue and take in the perspective of another with care, mutual embrace, and here's the departure from Gateshead. But the issues of hunger and feeding and their connection with heart have not been resolved, and they immediately appear in the journey to, as well as in the landscape of, the next place, Lowood. Okay, here ends the summary of my lyrical analysis of Chapter 4, and in the next recording I will read the lyrical analysis itself. Thank you for listening.